The card was still in the junk drawer. I found it on a Sunday afternoon in March, 3 weeks after my father's retirement party, while I was looking for a battery for the smoke detector. It was buried under takeout menus and a broken pen and a magnet from a vacation we'd taken 6 years ago. A small white envelope with my name written on it in my mother's handwriting, the careful, slightly formal script she used for things she considered important. I'm Megan. I was 41 years old, a pediatric occupational therapist, wife to Patrick, mother to 2 kids, Owen, who was 13 and obsessed with building things, and Lily, who was 9 and had recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist. I had a good life in Greenfield, Indiana, a town where everybody knew everybody, and the high school football games still drew the whole community on Friday nights. I had built that life carefully, deliberately, with the specific attention of someone who understood that stability doesn't arrive on its own. The card in the drawer was from my parents. Given to me at Christmas, 4 years ago, tucked into a modest gift bag alongside a candle that smelled like cinnamon and a $20 bill. Inside, in my mother Diane's handwriting, Megan, you've always been our rock. We are so proud of you. Love, Mom and Dad. I stood at the kitchen counter holding it, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not nostalgia, not warmth. Something closer to the sensation of seeing a familiar object from an unfamiliar angle and realizing you've been misreading it for years. 3 weeks earlier, at my father Gene's retirement party, I had discovered that my parents had given my sister Brooke a check for $40,000 to cover the down payment on the house she and her husband Kyle had just bought. Not a loan. A gift. Clean, documented, transferred without ceremony or announcement, the way my parents gave Brooke things, which was quietly and without the expectation of discussion. I had not received $40,000. I had received a card that said they were proud of me. The party had been my idea. I had organized it, booked the venue, coordinated the guest list, ordered the cake, written the tribute speech that made my father cry in front of 60 people. I had done all of it the way I always did all of it, because I was the one in the family who handled things. That had always been my role, and I had worn it with a pride I was only now beginning to examine. I put the card back in the drawer, but I didn't forget the number. $40,000. And the question underneath it, which I had been circling for 3 weeks without letting myself land on it directly. How much, exactly, had my parents given Brooke over the years? And what did it add up to? I closed the drawer and went back to the smoke detector, and I told myself the question could wait. It couldn't, of course. It never could. But I was very good at telling myself things that bought me a little more time inside the life I'd constructed before I had to look at what was holding it up. Let me tell you what my life actually looked like, so you understand what I was protecting. I woke up at 5:45 most mornings. Not because I had to, my first patient wasn't until 8:30, but because I needed that hour of quiet before the house became what it became when Patrick and the kids were in it. I made coffee. I reviewed my patient notes from the day before. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark with the specific pleasure of a person who has learned to take stillness seriously because she knows how quickly it disappears. My work was meaningful in the particular way that pediatric therapy is meaningful, which is to say it was exhausting and heartbreaking and occasionally transcendent, all within the same afternoon. I worked with kids whose bodies didn't do what they needed them to do, and I helped them find workarounds, adaptations, small strategies that added up to independence. I was good at it. Not just competent, genuinely skilled in the way that takes years to build and requires you to pay close attention to people who don't always have language for what they're experiencing. Patrick was a residential contractor. He'd built his own business over 15 years, and it was solid, not flashy, not expanding aggressively, just steady and well-regarded in the way that good work in a small town eventually becomes. We had bought our house 9 years ago with a conventional mortgage, a 15% down payment we'd saved over 4 years. No help from anyone. We'd been deliberate about it. My sister Brooke was 44 and lived 20 minutes away with her husband Kyle and their 2 teenage sons. Brooke was Brooke. She had always been Brooke, which meant she was warm and funny and genuinely lovable in ways that were completely real, and she was also the person in our family around whom all weather systems organized themselves. When Brooke was fine, everyone relaxed. When Brooke was struggling, and Brooke struggled regularly, in the spectacular, visible way of someone who had never quite learned that struggle didn't have to be public, the whole family shifted to address it. I had spent 41 years being the person who shifted. I didn't think of it that way then. I thought of it as being capable. I thought of it as being the kind of person who could handle things, who didn't need to be managed, who made everyone else's life slightly easier just by being reliably, dependable fine. The first sign that this self-image was costing me more than I'd calculated came not from the $40,000 check, that was later, but from a conversation at my mother's kitchen table in February, 6 weeks before the retirement party. I had stopped by to drop off groceries. My parents were both getting to the age where the larger shopping trips were harder, and I'd been doing a Sunday grocery run for them for about 2 years. Worked seamlessly into my weekend without anyone suggesting it or thanking me for it, just absorbed into the list of things Megan does. My mother was at the table when I came in on the phone, and she held up a finger in the 1-minute gesture and kept talking. I unloaded the bags and listened without meaning to. She was talking to Brooke. The tone was the specific tone she used with Brooke, softer, slower, slightly more careful, as if my sister were something that needed to be handled with reduced pressure. And she was saying, "Don't worry about the timeline, sweetheart. We'll make sure the numbers work. You just focus on finding the right place." I put a box of cereal in the pantry. I put the yogurt in the refrigerator. I didn't say anything when my mother hung up and turned to me and said, "Brooke and Kyle are looking at houses. It's such a stressful process." "I know," I said. "We went through it." "You're so much better at that kind of thing than Brooke," my mother said, warmly, as if it were a compliment. I smiled and said I had to get back for Owen's soccer thing, and I left, and I drove home on the familiar roads of Greenfield, and I told myself the conversation meant nothing. That my mother was just being supportive of Brooke in the way mothers were supportive of daughters who needed more support. Looking back now, that February afternoon was the first real moment I should have paused. Not because anything dramatic happened, nothing did. But because the way my mother had said "you're so much better at that kind of thing" had contained, without either of us naming it, an entire architecture of assumption. She was better at handling things, so she didn't need handling. She was capable, so she didn't need help. She was the rock, so the rock could hold its own weight indefinitely without anyone checking whether it was cracking underneath. I didn't pause. I drove to Owen's soccer game and cheered at the right moments and forgot the conversation by dinner. That was my flaw, running at full capacity. I had spent so long being the version of myself that everyone needed that I had stopped questioning whether it was accurate. The strong one. The capable one. The one who doesn't need anything. I had inhabited that identity so completely that it had become invisible to me. I couldn't see it as a role anymore, couldn't see the edges of it or the cost of it. It just felt like who I was. The retirement party came together over 6 weeks of my planning. Venue deposit paid by me and Patrick. Cake ordered, personalized with a photo from my father's first day at the plant 38 years ago. Invitations designed and sent. Caterer coordinated. My mother contributed opinions. Brooke contributed a flower arrangement she'd picked up the morning of. At the party, my father cried at my speech. My mother hugged me afterward and said, "You always know exactly what to say." Brooke had too much wine and danced with her sons, and it was genuinely sweet, genuinely her, and I felt the particular complicated warmth of loving someone you're beginning to resent. The way those two things don't cancel each other out but instead coexist in the same chest, pressing against each other. It was after the party, in the parking lot, when I overheard Kyle on his phone. He was standing by his car, jacket off, talking to someone I couldn't see. I was walking to my own car, keys in hand, and I caught it in fragments, not enough to reconstruct fully, enough to catch the shape. The 40, yeah, Jean transferred it last week. No, it's done. It's in the account. Brooke's not worried about it anymore. I kept walking. Got to my car. Sat in it for a moment with my hands on the wheel. 40. Jean. Transferred last week. I started the engine and drove home in the dark and said nothing to Patrick until we were in bed, and even then I said it lightly, framed as a question. "Did your parents help with our down payment and I just don't remember?" He looked at me. "No," he said. "Why?" Nothing, I said. Just thinking. But I wasn't thinking nothing. Something had tightened in my chest in the parking lot and hadn't released, and when I finally fell asleep it was still there, a small hard knot of something I didn't have a name for yet. I started paying attention differently after the parking lot. Not obsessively, I want to be precise about that. I was not going through bank records or making accusations or building a case. I was simply noticing things I had previously processed and discarded, things I had filed under. That's just how the family works without examining what that filing actually meant. I noticed, for example, that Brooke's kitchen had been redone about 4 years ago. New cabinets, new countertops, new appliances. I had been in that kitchen dozens of times since the renovation, and I had never thought to ask how they'd paid for it, because it hadn't been my business, and because I was not someone who kept track of other people's home improvements. But now I was thinking about it, and I couldn't remember Brooke ever mentioning a budget for it, or a contractor, or the months of saving that a renovation like that required. I noticed that Brooke and Kyle had taken their family to Costa Rica 2 summers ago, a trip Brooke had mentioned casually, the way people mention things that aren't a strain. Patrick and I had not taken a family vacation that year because we were replacing the roof. I noticed that my mother called Brooke every morning. Not every few days. Every morning, first thing, a check-in call that Brooke had mentioned once as just mom's thing. I called my mother twice a week, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I was the one who initiated. None of these things were evidence of anything. They were observations. But they were accumulating in a way that was starting to have weight. I called my best friend Tamara on a Wednesday night, after the kids were in bed and Patrick was watching something in the other room. Tamara and I had been friends since college, 20 years, through everything, the kind of friendship that had survived distance and bad years, and the particular strain of both becoming mothers at roughly the same time. I trusted her with the things I didn't say out loud to anyone else. "Can I ask you something weird?" I said. "Always," she said. "Did you know my parents gave Brooke money for her house?" A pause. Not long, a second, maybe 2. But I knew Tamara's pauses, and this one had something in it. "I heard something," she said carefully. "I didn't know the details." "You heard something," I repeated. "Brooke mentioned it to me a while back. That your parents were going to help with the down payment." Another pause. "I figured you knew." I sat with that for a moment. "When did she mention it?" "I don't know, Meg. A few months ago, maybe. We were getting coffee. And you didn't think to tell me." "I thought you knew," she said again. I didn't think it was something you didn't know." I believed her mostly. But the mostly was doing work it hadn't done before in 20 years of friendship, and I noticed that, and I filed it away alongside the kitchen renovation and the Costa Rica trip and the morning phone calls. Something had shifted inside me, not dramatically, not all at once. More like the slow repositioning of furniture in a room you've lived in so long you stopped seeing the layout. The room was the same. I was just starting to see it differently. I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my parents' house on a Thursday afternoon and asked to speak to my father. Gene was a quiet man, steady in the way of people who have spent decades in the same job, same house, same marriage. He and I had always had a functional relationship, warm enough, not particularly deep, built on my performance of competence and his comfortable reliance on it. He picked up on the third ring. "Just checking in," I said. "How are you feeling after the party?" "Good," he said. "Tired. Your mother's been after me to rest." "Dad," I said, and then I stopped, because I hadn't planned what came next, and what came next was more direct than I'd intended. "Did you give Brooke money for the house?" A silence that lasted too long to be comfortable. "We helped out a little," he said. "You know how things are with them." "How much?" I asked. Another pause. "Megan." "I'm not angry," I said, which was not entirely true. "I just want to understand." "We helped," he said again. "It wasn't. We just wanted to make sure they got settled. Brooke and Kyle have had a hard few years." I thought about the roof Patrick and I had replaced without help. I thought about the down payment we'd saved for 4 years. I thought about the card in the junk drawer. "Okay," I said. "I understand." I hung up and sat at my desk at work. I'd taken the call in my office, door closed, between patients, and I looked at the wall where I had a small framed print that one of my patients had made me years ago. A child named Declan who had spent 18 months learning to hold a crayon with enough control to draw what he saw in his head. The print was a house, crayon blue, with a sun in the corner and 4 stick figures out front. I thought about Declan's drawing on my office wall. The house with 4 stick figures. I thought about what it meant to build something, carefully, from nothing, while the people who were supposed to be in your corner watched from a comfortable distance and told you how impressive it was. I put the statements back in their folders in the order I'd found them. I told my mother the files were organized and labeled, and she said, "Oh, Megan, what would we do without you?" in the warm, automatic way she said it, and I smiled and said it was nothing and drove home. There was one more thing I needed to understand before I could decide what to do with what I knew. I needed to understand whether Tamara had known more than she'd admitted on the phone. Not because it changed the central facts, but because the specific ache of Tamara's pause on that Wednesday night had not resolved, and I was someone who needed complete pictures before I could act. I asked her to lunch. We met at a place we both liked, a Thai restaurant on the east side of Greenfield that had been there since we were in our 20s. Tamara was already at the table when I arrived, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who had been anticipating a conversation they'd been hoping to avoid. "How long have you known?" I said after we'd ordered. She wrapped both hands around her water glass. "Known what specifically?" "All of it. The pattern. Not just the house." She was quiet for a moment. "Brooke tells me things," she said finally. "She's told me things over the years. I didn't think it was my place." "You're my best friend," I said. "Not Brooke's." "I know," she said. "Megan, I know. I didn't want to be the one who told you something that was going to hurt you. I kept thinking you must already know. That you'd processed it and made peace with it." "I didn't know," I said. "I didn't know because nobody told me, and I didn't ask because I was too busy being the person who didn't need to ask." Tamara looked at me with something that was genuine and complicated, not guilt exactly, but the expression of someone who is understanding, in real time, the cost of a choice they made over a long period without examining it. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know you are," I said. And I did know. That was the hardest part. Tamara hadn't been malicious. She had done what people do when they're caught between 2 relationships and the easier path is to stay quiet. She had protected herself from the discomfort of delivering difficult information by deciding, repeatedly, that I already had it. That I was fine. That Megan always figured it out. Even Tamara had been living inside the story of who I was supposed to be. I ate my lunch, and we talked about other things, and when I left I hugged her at the parking lot and meant it, and also something between us had shifted into a different configuration, and we both knew it. That night I told Patrick everything. I sat across from him at the kitchen table after the kids were in bed, and I laid it out, the overheard parking lot conversation, the bank statements, the $127,000 tomorrow. All of it. Patrick listened with the focused stillness he brought to things that mattered, and when I finished he sat quietly for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to talk to my mother," I said. "I want to say it out loud, to her face, and I want to see what she says." "Okay," he said. "Do you want me there?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "This is between me and her." He nodded. He understood, which was one of the most valuable things about Patrick. He understood when something was mine to carry and didn't try to take it from me, even when it was heavy. I called my mother the next morning and asked if I could come for dinner on Friday. Just the 2 of us. My father had a long-standing Friday card game with his friends, a ritual he'd maintained for 20 years. She said of course, she'd make the chicken thing I liked. I spent the rest of the week being extremely ordinary. Work, kids, groceries, the Wednesday school pickup, the Thursday conference call that ran long. I moved through my days with the specific performance of normalcy that had always been my strongest skill, and underneath it the thing I was carrying was very heavy and very still. My mother made the chicken piccata. She had set the table properly, cloth napkins, the good plates, a candle, in the way she set things when she wanted a dinner to feel like an occasion. She poured wine before I'd even taken off my coat. I sat down across from her, and I looked at her face, 68 years old, my mother, with the particular quality that aging gives to faces you've known your whole life, the way the familiar features become simultaneously more and less themselves. I had loved this woman my entire life. I still did. That was the thing that made what I was about to say so much harder and so much more necessary. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing significant: Jean's recovery from the party, Owen's soccer season, and neighbor's new dog. My mother poured herself a second glass of wine. I had barely touched mine. Then I said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about the money." She set down her wine glass. The movement was careful, deliberate. She had known, I realized in that moment, that this conversation was coming. She had known it since the phone call with my father, possibly before that. "What money?" she said, which was the thing people say when they know exactly what money. "The $127,000 you've given Brooke in the last 4 years," I said. "And whatever came before that." She looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. This was not the confrontation I might have imagined in my 20s, or even my 30s. It was not heated. It was not dramatic. What it was two women sitting across a properly set dinner table in a quiet house in Greenfield, Indiana, and one of them finally saying out loud the thing that had been unsaid for 41 years. I felt completely calm. And underneath the calm, something enormous. "We helped her because she needed it," my mother said. "I know," I said. "I'm not asking why you helped her. I'm asking why you never asked if I needed anything." She opened her mouth, closed it. Her hands were very still on the table. "You were always fine," she said. "I was always fine," I repeated. "Because nobody ever asked if I wasn't." That landed. I could see it land, the slight change in her expression, something behind her eyes that was working through something real. "We never thought," she started. "You never thought because I never asked," I said. "And I never asked because I learned very early that asking wasn't my role. Brooke asked. I managed. That was the arrangement, and everybody was comfortable with it, and it never occurred to anyone, including me, for a long time, that comfortable arrangements can also be unfair ones." My mother was quiet. She was not crying. My mother rarely cried, which was something she and I shared and something she and Brooke did not. She was doing what she did when she was genuinely confronted with something. She went very still and she processed. "We gave you things," she said finally. "A card," I said. "At Christmas. That said you were proud of me." I paused. "I still have it. It's in my kitchen drawer." "Megan, I'm not asking for an apology that explains it away," I said. "I'm asking you to see it. To actually see it, the whole picture, what you gave Brooke over her lifetime and what you gave me, and what those two different numbers say about what you assumed about each of us." She looked at her wine glass. She looked at the candle. She looked, finally, at me. "We thought you were strong," she said. And the way she said it, not defensively, not as justification, but with a kind of quiet helplessness, as if she was only now hearing what those words actually meant, told me that something had shifted in her too. "I was strong because I had to be," I said. "There's a difference between being strong and having no other option." The silence between us was not hostile. That was the thing I hadn't anticipated. I had expected this conversation to feel like a confrontation, and what it felt like instead was something more like an accounting. Two people at a table, adding up numbers neither of them had looked at directly before. "I need you to know," my mother said slowly, "that I love you. That I have always loved you. That your father and I have always been proud of you." "I know," I said. And I did know. That was the complicated part of this. The love was real. The pride was real. And the inequality was also real, and all three things were true simultaneously, and none of them canceled the others out. "But you gave her things," I said, "and you gave me words. And I don't think you meant it as a statement about your values, but it became one." My mother put her hand over her mouth briefly. Then she lowered it. "What do you need from us?" she asked. The question surprised me. I hadn't expected it to arrive so directly, without more defense, without more justification. Maybe she had been waiting for the conversation too, in the way that people sometimes wait for the thing they've been avoiding, because the avoidance is more exhausting than the confrontation. "I need you to acknowledge it," I said. "Not to fix it. I don't need you to write me a check. I need you to acknowledge that the arrangement wasn't fair. That I wasn't asking for less. I was being given less." She nodded. Slowly, with the quality of someone absorbing something they can't unabsorb. "And I need things to be different going forward," I said. Not equal in some accounting sense. Just present. Ask me how I'm doing and mean it. Notice when I'm carrying something. Don't assume I'm fine just because I'm not crying about it. I can do that, she said. We didn't hug when I left. We stood in the doorway for a moment and my mother held my hand briefly, and I looked at her face, 68, my mother, tired and real, and I felt something I hadn't been expecting, a complicated, specific tenderness that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with finally being seen. I drove home through the dark streets of Greenfield and I cried in the car. Not from sadness exactly. From the particular release of a thing that has been held for a very long time finally being set down. Brooke called me 2 days later. My mother had talked to her. Of course she had. Brooke called and her voice was careful in a way it rarely was, the careful voice of someone who has been told something and is trying to figure out how to hold it. Mom told me you guys had a conversation, she said. We did, I said. Megan, she stopped. I didn't know you didn't know. About all of it, about how much. I just thought. You thought I knew, I said. Everyone thought I knew. Because I was fine, so I must have known and made peace with it. That's not, she stopped again. Then, more quietly, I'm sorry. I don't know if sorry is enough. But I'm sorry. I know you are, I said. There was a long pause. Can I take you to lunch, she said. Just us. I just want to, she trailed off. Yes, I said. Next week. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and looked out the window at the backyard where Owen had left his bike and Lily had left a collection of rocks she was sorting into categories I didn't understand, and I thought about what it meant to be a family. The actual complicated texture of it, the love and the damage and the assumptions and the accumulated weight of decades of choosing easy over honest. The lunch with Brooke was not a resolution. I want to be honest about that. We sat across from each other at a place in downtown Greenfield that had just opened, somewhere new that didn't carry the weight of 20 years of shared history, and we talked for 3 hours. Brooke cried twice. I didn't, which was not because I wasn't moved, but because I had cried in my car and in my kitchen and in the shower on 2 separate mornings, and by the time I sat down across from my sister, I was running on something steadier than emotion. What Brooke told me, over soup and bread and a second cup of tea, was that she hadn't thought about the asymmetry because she hadn't let herself think about it. It was easier, she said, with the specific honesty of someone who has just had something uncomfortable confirmed and is deciding to lean into it rather than away. Every time Mom and Dad helped, I was grateful and I moved on. I didn't add it up. I didn't compare. I told myself you were fine because you seemed fine, and I needed to believe that. I know, I said. That's not an excuse, she said. No, I said. But it's true. And I'd rather have the truth than an excuse. She looked at me across the table with something that was different from how she usually looked at me, not the comfortable assumption of my adequacy, but something more like genuine regard. Seeing me as a person rather than a function. That was new. It felt like something worth having. The months that followed were not dramatic. That's the honest account of what change looks like when it comes not from rupture, but from reckoning. It's quiet, incremental, and sometimes so subtle you're not sure it's happening until you look back from a distance and see the before and after. My mother called me differently. Not just the regular check-in calls, but calls that asked real questions and waited for real answers. She called once on a Tuesday evening when I hadn't initiated anything and said, "I've been thinking about you. How are you actually doing?" And I sat down on the couch and I told her, genuinely, with more honesty than I'd allowed myself in years, and she listened in a way that was different from before, not processing the information so she could provide the appropriate response, but actually present with it. My father was harder. Gene was not a man who opened new conversational territories easily, and the retirement party conversation had apparently reached him through my mother rather than directly from me, and he processed it in the private way he processed everything quietly, without report. But he started texting me. Small things, a photo of the maple tree in the front yard that had finally bloomed, a joke he'd heard that he thought Owen would like, a question about what Patrick was working on. Small, consistent, present. They were not the same parents I'd had before. They were something adjacent, parents who had been shown something true about themselves and were working, imperfectly and without a roadmap, toward a different configuration. With Tamara, Things took longer to find their footing. The trust wasn't broken, it was recalibrated. I had to let go of the version of Tamara I'd had, which was a version of my best friend who I assumed shared my perspective automatically, and accept instead a person who had her own loyalties and her own discomforts and who had made a choice I wouldn't have made. We had lunch in April and then in May, and somewhere around June something between us settled back into something real, not the original thing, but something honest in a way the original thing perhaps hadn't been. Because the original thing had rested partly on the assumption that Tamara saw everything I did. She didn't. Nobody sees everything you do. That had been another version of the same mistake, expecting to be known without having to be known. Patrick and I talked about money. Really talked about it, for the first time in a clear-eyed way that didn't have any pretense around it. We talked about the down payment and the roof and the years of building on our own, and I said out loud that it had mattered to me and that I had pretended it hadn't, and he said that he'd known it mattered and had been waiting for me to be ready to say so. We weren't angry about it, we were just finally, at 41, talking honestly about what we'd carried. One evening in May, Owen came into the kitchen while I was making dinner. He was 13 and at the specific stage of 13 where he was sometimes a child and sometimes something else entirely, and that evening he sat on the counter the way he'd sat since he was small and he said, "Mom, are you okay? You seem different lately." I looked at him, my son, who had his father's eyes and my mother's hands, and I thought about what to say. "I'm better than okay," I said. "I've been figuring some things out." He considered this with the seriousness he brought to things he found genuinely interesting. "Good things or hard things?" "Both," I said. "Usually those are the same." He nodded, apparently satisfied, and reached for an apple from the bowl on the counter and went back to whatever he'd been doing. I turned back to the stove and I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time, or perhaps had felt so infrequently that it had stopped registering as distinct. I felt like myself. Not the version of myself that was organized for others' convenience. Not the rock, the capable one, the one who holds it together. Just myself, a woman of 41 in a kitchen in Indiana, making dinner. Having recently said the true things out loud and found that the world had not ended and the love had not disappeared, and the only thing that had actually changed was that I no longer had to perform a version of fine that I didn't feel. The card was still in the junk drawer. I hadn't thrown it away. I thought about throwing it away several times. But every time I opened that drawer for batteries, for tape, for the random small items that accumulate in kitchen drawers, I saw it there and I left it. Not as a wound. Not as evidence. Just as a fact. Something that had happened, that had meant what it meant, that was now part of a larger story I understood more fully. One Saturday in June, I cleaned out the junk drawer entirely. Did it properly, threw away the broken pen and the takeout menus from restaurants that had closed, sorted the batteries, organized the tape and scissors and the spare key and the birthday candles. I picked up the card and I held it for a moment. "We are so proud of you." They were. That was the other true thing, the one that existed alongside everything else. They were proud of me. They loved me. They had also, for 41 years, taken my capability as permission to look away, and they were now, slowly and imperfectly, learning to look back. I put the card in a box where I kept things I wasn't ready to discard. Not the junk drawer. Somewhere I'd chosen deliberately. Then I finished cleaning the drawer and made lunch and called Owen in from the backyard and listened to Lily explain, at length and with considerable expertise, the difference between a sea urchin and a sea cucumber, and I was present for every word of it. That was what different looked like in the end. Not dramatic. Not unrecognizable. Just present, in a way I hadn't quite been before. Not performing presence, not managing presence, just actually there. I had spent 41 years being the person who held things together. I was learning, slowly, that I was also allowed to be the person things were held for. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Parents almost never set out to create a favorite child. That's the uncomfortable truth this story keeps circling. Diane didn't look at her two daughters and decide that one deserved a house and the other deserved a card. What she did was something quieter and, in some ways, more damaging. She responded to the path of least resistance for 41 years and called it love. Brooke asked. So Diane gave. Megan didn't ask. So Diane assumed she didn't need. The mathematics of this seemed obvious to everyone inside the family. It was just how things worked, just the natural distribution of attention based on apparent need. What nobody examined was the circular logic holding the whole thing up. Megan didn't ask because she'd learned not to, and she learned not to because asking had never been her assigned role. And the role had been assigned so early and so consistently that it had become invisible, even to her. The $127,000 in bank statements is the clearest number in the story, but it isn't the most significant one. The most significant number is the 20 years Tamara spent knowing something and deciding it wasn't her place to say it. Because Tamara's silence reveals something that goes beyond one friendship. The story of Megan as capable had become so widely accepted, so deeply embedded in the people around her, that even her closest friend had used it as a reason to stay quiet. The identity had become its own protection for everyone except Megan. What the dinner table confrontation accomplished was not justice in any measurable sense. Diane didn't write a check. The 41 years weren't undone. What happened instead was the introduction of a shared reality, a moment in which the invisible became visible and could not be made invisible again. Diane's answer, "We thought you were strong," was not a defense. It was finally an admission not of malice, but of something almost worse, decades of comfortable assumption dressed as recognition. Megan's decision not to ask for money, but for acknowledgement, is the most psychologically precise moment in the story. It shows that she understood, by the time she sat down across from her mother, that the injury wasn't financial. The financial disparity was evidence of the injury. The injury itself was invisibility, the specific pain of being so reliably present that no one thought to look for you. What she rebuilt in the months after wasn't a relationship with her family so much as a relationship with herself. The version of Megan that had existed before that Friday dinner was functional and accomplished and genuinely capable, and also, quietly, built around an absence she'd never named. The version that emerged afterward was the same woman, same life, same kitchen in the same town, but present in it differently. Not performing adequacy for an audience that had stopped noticing. Just there. What stays with me about this story is how long the damage went unnamed, not because anyone was hiding it, but because everyone had agreed, without ever discussing it, that this was simply how things were. Megan was strong. Brooke needed more. The arrangement made sense to everyone inside it, which is exactly what makes arrangements like this so hard to see and so slow to change. I think about how many people are living inside a version of this right now, not being cheated or abandoned, nothing dramatic, just quietly being handed less and being told, through 100 small signals, that less is appropriate for someone as capable as them. If this story does anything, I hope it makes you ask, what have you been accepting as your role that was actually just someone else's convenience? Because capable and invisible are not the same thing. And you are allowed to be both strong and seen.